everybody. Thank you for joining us on one of our Safer at Home programs. As somebody put on a chat, I sound very quiet. I give you a little behind the scenes thing. My laptop was acting up, so was scrambling, and I'm now using my wife's new laptop, which has never used Zoom before until tonight. So I haven't figured out all the nuances for that, but trust me that there was some. If I had enough hair left to pull out, I was pulling it out, trying to make sure that we pulled this off. But work with me on this one tonight, folks. It's not you, it's me. Before we get started tonight, a couple things. All our talks, as you know, are brought to you by Cape Cod 5. First Citizens Federal Credit Union and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All the books that are on this are on our programs are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you make sure that you partake of the local establishments. If you make sure that you put on mute so we can hear our speaker tonight. And at the bottom, we see the chat feature. We'll ask questions at the end, so we'll use that. If my audio keeps going bad, I'm just going to have you ask your own questions. So but we'll figure that one out. Our speaker tonight, David Bell, is a professor at Princeton. He's coming to us from New York City. He's a historian of early modern and modern Europe. And when I saw this book, I have to confess that I am a sucker for charisma and cult of personality. And when this came out, this was I couldn't not ask him. So would you welcome to our speaker tonight, David Bell?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mark, for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here in scare quotes. I'm really sorry that I couldn't come to Falmouth in person. I've spent my life actually going to Martha's Vineyard. My family and I always have this ritual of going through Falmouth early, a couple of hours before the ferry, so that we can always stop at Seafood Sam's on Route 28 and get loaded up with fried clams and such before we get on the ferry. So I love the town of Falmouth. I love that part of the Cape. I've spent a lot of time there. So again, I'm particularly sorry that because of the pandemic, I'm not able to come in person. So I'm just going to talk for probably 20 minutes, maybe about my book, give you a very brief overview of it, show some slides, and then I'm very happy to take your questions about it. This is a book that I published last year. It came out last summer. It's something I worked on for quite a while before that. As Mark said, I'm an historian. Really, I was trained as an historian of the French Revolution above all, but I've worked on really the early modern world, as we call it, so 17th, 18th, early 19th centuries, looking not only at France, but also at Britain, Germany, the United States somewhat, and now more recently, the Caribbean and South America, all of which go into this book. But the subject of the book is political charisma. Political charisma has always been a sort of a key part of the political landscape of the United States. Certain political leaders seem to have a kind of magnetic appeal. The most obvious in my own lifetime is John Kennedy. The same thing is said about Ronald Reagan, about a few others who seem to stand out from the pack, who seem to stand out from other politicians because they have these qualities that just draw people to them. And so it's a phenomenon which has always interested me. Why do we have this phenomenon? How does it work in politics? What are its implications for political life? How does it influence political life? And I wanted to look at it really in relation to the period that I know best, which is what we could also call the Age of Revolution, which is the moment when modern democratic governments were founded, when they came into being. So the book is actually looking at the birth of what we could call modern forms of political charisma. Now, there are lots of forms of charisma. Kings have had it, priests have had it, prophets have had it, great actresses and actors have had it, great writers have had it. Somebody like Jean-Jacques Rousseau could be considered charismatic. But politicians have also had it. Kings have had it, as I said, queens. But in the period that I look at, I think charisma really changed in its nature, because if you think about a king being charismatic, a king has a certain degree of charisma because of who he is, because of who he's born to. He has it by virtue of the office he's inherited. He has it by virtue of his ancestors. He has it by virtue, in many cases, of actually receiving the sanction of a church. And in the French case, actually being doused with holy oil at his coronation. But democratic figures also have a charisma, but it's not a charisma which comes to them by birth. It's a charisma that they have to earn, that they get as a result of what they've done rather than who they are in part. And so I wanted to look at charismatic figures in the Age of Revolution. I particularly look at 4 particular figures. Let me just see if I can put them up here. Let's see here up. So here we go. Here they are. So we have George Washington, obviously very famous, in the Napoleon Bonaparte here on the upper right, and then somewhat less well known in the United States, Tucson Duvall, the first leader of at least a quasi-independent Haiti, which had been a French colony, which rebelled at the period of the French Revolution against France. And then Simone Bolivar, the great libertador, the great liberator of the northern part of South America from Spanish rule. And the book is really, it consists largely of a series of case studies of these 4 men, 1 chapter on each, setting them in their context, asking what made them look charismatic to their followers, and how did this charisma, what influence did this charisma have on the political lives of these 4 countries? And one of the basic arguments of the book is that charisma is very much a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was very important for these revolutionary societies to have these charismatic figures. If you think about somebody like George Washington, it's often said that if he hadn't been around, the Constitution would never have been ratified in the United States. It was only ratified, the states only put their, people in the states only put their trust in a strong federal government because they knew that Washington would be the first president, and they trusted him. And if he hadn't been there, if there hadn't been a figure they were attracted to, that they were really almost in love with and whom they trusted, then the Constitution might never have actually been ratified. So, and I think one of the things I try to explain in the book is that these new revolutionary political systems that had constitutions, that had representative governments that were democratic, these systems were actually quite strange for people at the time. They'd never, even in the United States, they'd never quite lived under systems like this. Yes, in a place like Massachusetts, you did have the General Assembly, which is to say you had the legislature, you had town meetings, so you did have some parts of democratic life, even in Massachusetts, but the people of Massachusetts were still living in a colony, and they lived under a king. They were part of a monarchy, and in fact, one thing which people don't always remember is that the king was very popular in the American colonies right down until the end, right down until he sided with Parliament in 1775-76 and made very clear that he did not approve of what was going on in the colonies. And at that point, the colonists, the revolutionaries, turned against him. So people were not used to a system where you elected all of your leaders. They were not used to a system where you might have to trust your political destinies to somebody you had voted against, somebody you didn't know in person. So it mattered that you had these charismatic figures who seemed to exude confidence, who seemed to exude sort of great natural abilities, and whom people could really, in a sense, again, fall in love with and trust. So in that sense, it was very important to naturalize, as I put it, these new democratic systems, to put some flesh on the bones of the constitutions that came into being at this time. But if that was the good side of political charisma in the Age of Revolution, there was also the dangerous side, because if you had charismatic figures like this who were able to develop a kind of direct relationship with their followers, with their admirers, with their supporters, then that relationship might trump the constitutional rules of the game. It might lead to these figures deciding, well, they don't want to play by the constitutional rules, and so they'll overturn the constitutions, overthrow the regimes, and become dictators. And in fact, if you look at Napoleon Bonaparte, if you look at Tucson Duvall, if you look at Simone Bolivar, all 3 of them became dictators in one way or another. Napoleon eventually, of course, became emperor of France as well. And even George Washington, while he obviously did not become a dictator, he could have done had he wished. Washington had an incredible ability to sort of sway the minds of people in the United States, and we're actually very fortunate that he decided that he never decided to abuse the enormous influence that he had over the American population. So that's really the fundamental argument that I make in the book, and I do it through the case studies of these four figures. But I also try to make a point about charisma itself, because we tend to assume, we talk about charisma as being simply a personal quality that people have or they don't. So you're either lucky enough to be born with it, like a Kennedy, like a Reagan, or not. And I think that's actually something of a misunderstanding, to think that charisma is this kind of mysterious, ineffable personal quality, and that's all there is to it. Because actually, if you think about it, charisma is really more of a relationship. You don't only need the person to have certain qualities, but you need an audience for that person. You need an audience to recognize those qualities and to react to the person in a certain way, in a certain, actually highly emotional way. And often the same qualities that make a person look very charismatic to one audience, actually make them look totally uncharismatic to a different audience. We could look, for instance, at that recent American president whom President Biden calls the former guy. To his supporters in the Republican Party, he is intensely charismatic, and yet to many other people, including the majority of the voters in Massachusetts, he is anything but charismatic. Speaking of Donald Trump, of course. So charisma is, in that sense, a relationship. Somebody like Napoleon Bonaparte, incredibly charismatic for much of the French population, but there was part of the French population who hated him, who didn't see him as charismatic at all. And then there were the British. They called him bony, like being too bony, literally. They called him the Corsican ogre. They thought he was anything but charismatic. They didn't recognize those qualities in him. So one thing that I'm trying to do in the book is not just to look at these figures themselves, but actually to look at their audiences and to look at the political and cultural context in which they operated, and to say, what was it that made people see them as charismatic in the period? What was it that made people see them as so attractive? A Napoleon Bonaparte, a Tucson Duvall, a Simone Bolivar again, and a George Washington. What was it about America at the time that made Washington look so charismatic? What was it that made Napoleon look so charismatic? And so on and so forth. So a lot of the book is actually about what I call the political culture of these different countries at this period. And much of it is asking why a particular sort of leader could actually have such appeal back in the 18th century. And I focus, and therefore there's quite a lot that I do on the culture. For instance, I talk quite a lot about newspapers, because one remarkable thing about the 18th century is that although it seems odd to use the phrase about the 18th century, it was a period of a media revolution. For the first time, you had newspapers that were appearing, daily newspapers that were appearing all over, particularly the English-speaking world, but really all over the Atlantic world, and relaying news on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. And this really changed the relationship that people had with their political leaders. Now, changes in media, in fact, always change politics. We've seen just in the past 20 years, or even in the past 10 years, in the United States, the way that the introduction of social media has changed political life, the way things like Twitter and Facebook have changed political life. Before that, we had the way the television changed political life, the way it made somebody like John Kennedy such a star in a way that would have been more difficult for him before. Radio and newsreels themselves had a huge effect before that. And even before that, you had the newspapers. And the newspapers really came in, particularly in the 18th century. In addition to newspapers, you also had engravings that mattered a great deal. Here's a remarkable engraving which was published sometime in the early 1820s in South America. And what it shows is it's actually an engraving about an engraving. What we have here is a father of a family who seems to be of mixed race, and quite clearly somewhere in Venezuela. And he is showing to his family, he and his wife here, are showing to their children a picture of Simone Bolivar. And they're showing an engraving. And in Spanish it says below, aquí está su libertador, here is your liberator. And this illustrates, I think, quite dramatically the way that mass media, that this new print media actually played a very important role in changing the relationship people had with their leaders. Because if you think about it, did people know what their leaders even looked like before this period, before the 18th century? Where would you have seen a picture of a king or a queen? Well, for most people in a country, the answer is you only would have seen this in one place, namely on a coin. And you wouldn't have seen a very clear image on a coin. And it wouldn't have been necessarily, even an image you would have spent a lot of time looking at. It didn't really look all that much like the person, particularly in the very small, crude copper coins that circulated in most of the Atlantic world. But then in the 18th century, not only did you have newspapers, such as this Boston newsletter, but then you also had the engravings that started to circulate really in quite large numbers. So people could now see what their leaders looked like, and they could follow stories about their leaders from day to day. And that forged really quite a different relationship between people and their leaders. In addition, the very language in which people started to read about political leaders changed. And it was influenced by the most popular genre of the time, which was the novel. The novel is also a great creation of the 18th century. People began to read novels in extremely large numbers, began to really identify with the characters in novels. The novels started to use highly emotional, what we call sentimental language. And this also became a kind of model for what people started to write about political leaders. Let me give you here one example, one really striking example. So here is one of the first really popular political biographies ever published in the United States. It is The Life of George Washington with Curious Anecdotes, published by Parson Mason Locke Weems. And the first edition actually came out in 1800, right after George Washington's death. And there were even some sort of predecessors for this, but not as good, really written during Washington's own lifetime. And if you read this book, which was one of the most popular books ever in the United States up to this time, you can see that it's actually written in a highly intimate, highly emotional language. It focuses not on Washington, the public figure, but it actually focuses on Washington, the private man. Weems says right at the beginning of the book, he says, if you want to know the real man, if you want to know the public figure, you have to look at his private life. And Weems, in fact, made up just one story after another about George Washington. You all know the story about how the young George cuts down his father's favorite cherry tree. And then when his father asks him about it, he said, "Oh, Pa, I can't tell a lie." Well, that anecdote was simply made up out of whole cloth by Mason Locke Weems for this biography. But Weems, talked about Washington again in highly emotional terms. He said everybody loved him. He was so handsome. He was so dashing. He was so graceful. You read this book and you fall in love with Washington yourself. And so this as well, I think, contributed. It changed the way that people started to read about and to understand their political leaders. In addition, people began to see their political leaders sometimes as geniuses. The 18th century was also a great age of the genius. And here we have probably the single most famous genius, a real scientific genius of the time, namely Isaac Newton. But people began to think of political leaders as being particularly gifted. Somebody like Washington was noted not for being a genius particularly, but for being incredibly strong. He was very tall and handsome. He was also incredibly strong, physically strong. He was known for supposedly being able to throw things across the Delaware River at its narrowest point. I don't really quite believe that, but but there were endless stories told about not only his physical strength, but his grace, his charm, and so on and so forth. He was seen as a really exceptional human being. Napoleon Bonaparte was very much seen as a genius, and so was Simone Bolivar, and compared to somebody like Isaac Newton. In addition to this, it was very important. This was also an era of almost constant warfare. So let me put it, there's actually another character, somebody I actually start the book with because he was a kind of model for the other four figures. This is somebody who is not very well known in the United States today, unless you've been to the suburb of Philadelphia called Paoli, Pennsylvania. Well, you might be familiar with the name in that case. But this is Pasquale Pauli, who was the first leader of the independent state of Corsica. It was the island of Corsica off the coast of Italy and France, actually was an independent state for a time in the middle of the 18th century. And Pauli was its leader, and he attracted enormous attention because he was this dashing military leader who managed to defeat the much larger forces of France and the Italian state of Genoa, and to lead his people to liberty. And, and he became, as I was saying, a kind of model that these other figures, particularly Napoleon, who of course was himself from Corsica, who these later figures followed, but also even George Washington. Much of the cult of George Washington, if we can call it that, in the United States, was modeled after the way that the Americans had made a hero earlier out of Pasquale Pauli, who was then almost completely forgotten when Washington came along. We can see here one of the earliest books written about Pauli was published in England by James Boswell, who's better known as the author of The Life of Samuel Johnson. But this book, that was the first book he wrote, an account of Corsica, is, again, an incredibly sort of emotional, sentimental portrait of Pauli that particularly dwells on his military genius and the way that he was able to, in a sense, regenerate, to give his entire society a new birth and to create a new nation through war. So that's yet another factor which was really important here. And I'll just show you here. This is this is an abridged version of Boswell's book that was actually published in American newspapers at the time. So he was very well known in America. And in fact, the idea of a kind of offshore colony struggling for independence against a much more powerful overseas country, in this case, France, certainly resonated in the colonies that were struggling for their independence against Great Britain. So some of the earliest poems about George Washington that were written and published in the United States actually simply took older poems about Paoli and simply literally substituted the name Washington for Paoli. That is so that again is another element of the book. I think the final element of the book, and then I'll stop there after that and take your questions, is that these four figures are obviously not all the same. They're really quite different in many ways. George Washington was a very reserved person in general. He did not work to develop a kind of cult of personality around himself, even though a cult of personality did develop around him, despite all his attempts to discourage it. Napoleon Bonaparte, on the other hand, very much did encourage a cult of personality around himself. So did Tucson Duvall, so did Simone Bolivar. But one of the most fascinating things I found in writing the book was that these different political leaders actually learned a great deal from each other. As I said, Washington was very much influenced by the example of Pasquale Paoli. And then Bonaparte found it very useful to make use of the legend of George Washington. So Napoleon Bonaparte became famous as a general of the French Republic. He took power in France through a coup d'etat at the end of the year 1799 and from a general of the Republic, he became what was called the first consul, the kind of supreme leader of France. And then 3 years later, he became consul for life. And 2 years after that, he crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral. But almost immediately, just a few weeks after Napoleon had taken power, George Washington died back in Virginia and was buried at Mount Vernon. And when the news got to France, it was actually something that Napoleon found very useful. So he held some elaborate funeral ceremonies, a kind of memorial service for George Washington in Paris, in the Invalides, where Napoleon himself today is buried. This is actually what you see here is actually a printed funeral eulogy for Washington that was delivered and it gives the revolutionary date of the 20th of Pluvio's year 8. It was in fact February of the year 1800. And in this eulogy, the orator not only praised Washington to the sky, but also used the eulogy as a way of drawing a comparison between Washington and Bonaparte himself, and also very subtly sort of changed it in order to put Bonaparte himself in the best possible light. And one of the most interesting things that the orator said, and that Napoleon made great use of, was that the orator said, well, Washington himself, he governed more through feeling, through sentiment, than he did through laws. He governed because of his direct bond with the people. And that's something that Napoleon then took to heart and said, well, this is what I'm doing too. It doesn't really matter that I overthrew the previous government in a coup d'etat. What matters is that the French all love me. And that's really what makes me legitimate. So he was sort of drawing on the example of Washington to legitimize himself as a kind of Republican leader, as somebody who would still defend the legacy of the French Revolution. But at the same time, he was subtly changing the message to say, look, what really matters is the personal bond between a leader and the people. That's what matters more than a constitution, more than a Bill of Rights, more than anything else. And then I can talk if people are interested about Toussaint Louverture and his connection to these other figures. But I'll stop here by talking about Simone Bolivar, who was the liberator of much of South America. And Bolivar is very interesting for his own relationship with these earlier figures, because Bolivar was born into the kind of the high gentry of Venezuela. He was educated, he got a military education in Spain. He came back to Venezuela in, just before the independence movements began, which was to say in 1809, 1810. And he then very quickly became the leader of Venezuela in its struggle for independence against Spain, which involved several wars, a great deal of incredibly bloody conflict, and then actually went on to liberate what is now Colombia, Panama, Peru, Bolivia, and as well as Venezuela. So he really liberated about half the continent and created out of these countries this big new confederation that was called Greater Colombia, and that survived until his death. But all through his career as a liberator, Bolivar was often hailed as the Washington of South America. And when he talked to, and in some ways he modeled himself after Washington. There were moments when he said, yes, I too don't really want to be the head of this country. I will resign when the time is right. But there were other moments when he clearly modeled himself after Napoleon Bonaparte. And this is one example. Because one of the striking coincidences in this history is that in the year 1804, when Bolivar was still a very young man, he had been traveling in Europe, and he was in Paris when Napoleon crowned himself emperor of the French. So, and this is what Bolivar later said about this. He said, during the last month of 1804, I saw the coronation of Napoleon in Paris, and it filled me with enthusiasm. And he goes on, above all because of the sentiments of love that an immense population was showing for the French hero. And he talks about that general effusion of every heart, that free and spontaneous popular movement aroused by the glory, by the heroic deeds of Napoleon, who was being cheered by more than 1 million individuals. It seemed to me the ultimate ambition of man. And so it's clear that Bolivar took a great deal of inspiration from Napoleon, and in a sense wanted to be the Napoleon of South America. So we can see then that the creation of a charismatic legend was not the same in every country, but that it changed from country to country in part as these different leaders learned from each other. So I think, let me see how I've done on time here. Yeah, it's 7:30, so I think this is probably a good time to stop. So I said, this is a very brief overview of the book, but I'm happy to take whatever questions people might have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. It was awesome. A question for you, and again, if you got a question, use the chat feature down below. Obviously, you focus on 4 military leaders, so by definition, they obviously have to have success on a battlefield, but they also have to have an enemy, an opponent, the great other that you're fighting. What happened? Obviously, it works for the certain, and Washington's different because he's Cincinnatus. He's the one that's willing to just fight and go back to his farm. But the other ones I don't think quite are. What happens? They need a foil. So when that foil goes away, what becomes of their charisma, their cult of personality? And frankly, how did you had mentioned this before? How did they all foster their own cult of personality? How did they do that?
Okay, well, great questions. Let me start with that last one, actually, about how they fostered the cult of personality, because this was very different in all the 4 cases. So if you look at George Washington, as I said, there was definitely a cult of personality around him, which he himself was very uncomfortable with, and he did very little to actually spur this on. So in Washington's case, it was very clear, and this goes back to the point I was making about charisma and sort of the need to understand the audience, that the audience desperately wanted somebody like him. right? The audience desperately, I mean, this was, again, 1775, 1776, particularly the period I look at most closely, when the United States has just declared independence. They are fighting a desperate war against the most powerful empire on earth for independence. And actually, at the beginning, the war goes terribly. I mean, Washington has a success in Boston in the spring of 1776. He's able to drive the British out of Boston. But then after the Declaration of Independence in July, everything goes downhill. He loses the Battle of New York. He's chased across New Jersey. His army goes down by 90%. The British are saying to each other, oh, it's all over now. The Americans are going to give in, and we'll see them all hanging from the yardarm, within a few months. So the Americans desperately needed somebody like Washington, a kind of big, tall, handsome, heroic, figure whom they could trust. So the cult of personality appears around him through newspaper articles, engravings. There's all sorts of what I would call tchotchkes that come out. His face is printed on handkerchiefs, on crockery. People are writing poems galore to him, about him. They rewrite the words "To God Save the King" with the words "God damn the King, God save great Washington." So with Washington, it's something which very much, and really throughout his entire career, it's something which simply kind of happens around him. Now, the other figures, particularly Napoleon. Napoleon is really an expert propagandist, and Napoleon works very hard to create the image around him. So he gets artists. For example, Jacques-Louis David, you all saw, I showed it briefly, the famous portrait of of Napoleon on horseback. That's a great example of this. Napoleon, but he publishes, even when he's just a general of the Republic, he sponsors newspapers devoted basically to reporting on him. He sponsors printed engravings that people can pin up on their walls. He sponsors poetry about him. There are plays that are written about him, and so on and so forth. And Bolivar does a great deal of this same sort of thing as well. Toussaint Louverture is the most interesting case because he himself was born a slave in this horrible situation of this French sugar colony called Saint-Domingue at the time. We now call it Haiti. But born into slavery, was freed by his master in the 1770s when he was in his 30s, and he went on then to lead one of the great slave rebellion. But much of his charisma comes from his ability to appeal really by word of mouth in the Creole language to other former slaves. And yet at the same time, there are a lot of people, particularly among the French people who are his allies, that they're willing to, that they want to sort of hold him up as a leader as well. So they're writing poetry about him and writing newspaper articles about him and so on and so forth. So with Toussaint Louverture, there's something of a mix. Now, just to come to your other question about sort of the enemy and what happens with it. Well, I mean, what's interesting is that it's only really in Washington's case that the war is ever won entirely. So in the United States, of course, the war is won at Yorktown in 1781. The final peace treaty is signed with the British in 1783. And after that, independence is assured. And Washington retires. He goes back to his farm. He's called out of retirement to be president of the United States and retires again after 2 terms in March of 1797. But Napoleon fights wars all through his career, and it's partly his own megalomania and ambition that drive these wars, but it's also partly that he's gotten into a kind of process of war fighting that the wars continue almost of their own inertia, and it's very hard to stop them. Simone Bolivar as well is fighting. He fights wars until 1825, just 5 years before his death, when finally Peru and Bolivia are liberated from the Spanish. And even after that, he's fighting constant struggles to keep his great Colombian Federation together. Toussaint Louverture fights against the French, then he fights with the French against the British and against other enemies. And then he starts to fight against the French again at the end of his life. So with Toussaint Louverture also, there's never a stop to the wars. And it's the fact that in these other countries, the wars keep going on, which is one of the major reasons why these major crises develop, and finally these figures feel like they have to take power. So that's how I would answer those questions.
You kind of touched on this, and somebody said, "Tell us more about Tucson," because you touched on that one. It seems like the publicists for these four men were important. You kind of were leading into that. What was their relationship to their topics and to each other? So I think um, you just expounded what you were just talking about.
Yeah. Well, let me talk about Toussaint Louverture a little bit there and his publicists, because it's very interesting. So again, as I said, and he's really an extraordinary character. I mean, of all these four people, I mean, Washington was born into the, into the gentry of Virginia, and then married into the highest possible level of Virginia society when he married Martha Custis. Napoleon was born into the gentry of Corsica, not, not all that high a level where France was concerned, but pretty good nonetheless. Bolivar was born into the highest ranks of Venezuelan society. So these people all started off pretty well. I mean, with at least maybe not a silver spoon in their mouth, maybe a really good quality pewter spoon, at least for Napoleon. But Toussaint Louverture, again, born a slave, and then, but really quite an extraordinary man. I mean, he, as a young man, he learned to sort of train animals, and it was a way of, very crucially for him, of getting out of being a field slave, working, cutting down sugarcane. So he took care of animals. He was famous for actually jumping up on the back of wild horses and breaking them, at great risk to himself, I might add. He was constantly breaking his bones. Then became so valuable to his master that his master actually freed him. Then afterwards, in this, sort of really quite evil society, he saw the only chance for himself of actually becoming a plantation owner himself. So he briefly tried to establish a plantation and even had slaves of his own. But then that plantation failed. He went back to work for his previous master, and was working there as a sort of trusted sort of keeper of animals when the French Revolution broke out, destabilized the colony, and it allowed him to become one of the leaders of this great slave rebellion in 1791, which is still the single largest slave rebellion in history. And he then became very quickly one of the leaders of this rebellion, one of the military leaders. When Spain went to war with France, if you think about the island of Hispaniola, still divided in half between Haiti on one side and the Dominican Republic on the other. So the Haiti had been a French colony. The Dominican Republic had been a San Domingo had been a Spanish colony. So when Spain went to war against France, Toussaint Louverture signed up as a Spanish officer in return for promise for freedom for his family and for his friends, and fought for Spain for a while. Then in 1793, the French Revolution, which had turned more radical, abolished slavery in their own colonies. So eventually he went back to fighting for France against the Spanish and then against the British, and became known as a really also quite a military genius. But to come to the publicists, so it was very important for Toussaint Louverture to be able to, as he became really the leader of the colony, because he commanded, because the population of the colony at the time, there were about 500,000 blacks and only about 15,000 whites and another 20,000 people of mixed race. So whoever was commanding the black forces was going to be the real leader of the colony. And so it was very important for the French people who were there, the French revolutionary officials, to cultivate a relationship with him. So they sort of tried to build him up, and they worked with him. And he had secretaries. He himself spoke very good French, but had never and knew how to read and write, but had never been to school because he was born a slave. So he never learned how to spell in French. So he had a series of secretaries when he wrote letters. And then when he wrote proclamations and addresses, who would actually write it out for him in sort of good grammatical and properly spelled French. And he made very good use of these secretaries. He made very good use of his relationship with a series of French officers who were really quite in awe of him and in his talent, and started writing articles about him, including for newspapers back in France. And all of this helped him sort of rise up to eventually become appointed a major general and governor of the colony. And again, this is still while France is still at least theoretically in control here. And it's a very volatile situation, but really quite extraordinary when you think the first African American became a general in the American Army in 1940. became a brigadier general. And here's Toussaint Louverture, a major general already in 1797. And he then becomes governor of the colony in 1799, again, a very high rank to be the governor of the major French colony. Back at a time when no person of African descent anywhere else in the Atlantic world, except in Africa itself, could hope to rise up to a position like that. And then he increasingly made use of sort of printed proclamations, of newspaper articles, and so on and so forth. So that's how I would sort of talk a little more about Toussaint. And so.
Thank you. Not that the U.S. the American Revolution was necessarily the blueprint, but of the four, we talked about Paoli, but of the four major figures, obviously the American Revolution is the first.
Mm-hmm.
How are the other three viewed in the United States? How do Americans view Napoleon, Bolivar, Toussaint? How do they view them?
It's a great question, and again, in large part, it depends. So, in the United States, at the beginning of the French Revolution comes first, and at the beginning of the French Revolution, there's a great wave of enthusiasm for it in the United States. We think, oh, they're copying us. How nice, right? There's a poet now completely forgotten named Philip Freneau, Princeton graduate, class of I think 1771, who wrote a poem saying, the blaze is kindled and now expands around the world. And Thomas Jefferson, who's there in Paris, is writing these enthusiastic letters back. Benjamin Franklin is hailing the French Revolution. But then later on, as the French Revolution turns more and more violent, as the king is executed and the reign of terror happens, there are a lot of people in the United States who get horrified by the French Revolution, turn against it. And the French Revolution becomes actually one of the major dividing lines in American politics in the 1790s. It's one of the principal issues that separates the Federalists, which is to say George Washington and John Adams's party, from the Democratic Republicans, Adams, Madison, Monroe, and so on and so forth. And the Democratic Republicans are enthusiastic about the French Revolution. The Federalists are not, and are much more favorable towards Great Britain, which is at war with France. And this really continues when Napoleon takes power. I think there are Americans who are happy to see France stabilized, to see the terror at an end. But nonetheless, it really depends on their own partisan position. The Federalists who are favorable towards Britain are much more likely to see Napoleon the way the British do, as a monster and an ogre and a dictator, while other Americans are much more favorable towards him. Now, if you look at the Haitian Revolution, it's a different sort of set of calculations, because it's a slave rebellion, and this terrifies the heck out of American slave owners. So Thomas Jefferson, for instance, calls the Haitians a nation of cannibals, and there's terrible fear that the Haitian Revolution will spread to the United States and that the slaves in America will revolt as well. And because the slave owners were always, of course, in terrible fear of this, their guilty consciences in part prompting these fears in them. And so there is this terrible fear. There's a kind of absolute embargo on news from Haiti. They don't want any news of this coming into the country, and they don't want anybody to possibly to copy this. At the same time, interestingly, the Adams administration, partly in order because they are engaged in a what is called the quasi-war against France. There's a kind of period of hostilities between the United States and France in the 1790s. The United States actually cultivates Haiti, saying Trump, because they want to actually sort of try to separate Haiti from France. So there's kind of unofficial treaty and contacts between the Adams administration and Toussaint Louverture. So it gets actually quite complicated there. But after Haiti actually achieves independence, which is at the beginning of the year 1804, at that point, pretty much it's the horror stories that win out. There are massacres of white colonists. Most of the whites end up fleeing Haiti. These atrocity stories are repeated and exaggerated in the American press. And the United States doesn't actually recognize Haiti. It doesn't give diplomatic recognition to Haiti until 1862 during the Civil War under Abraham Lincoln. So in general, after that, there's really not a lot of enthusiasm among the white American population for Haiti. On the other hand, Toussaint Louverture becomes a legend among African Americans. And from early on and then right through the Civil War, he is an enormous sort of underground hero, and his name is passed back and forth. Slaves, even if they have to take the names that their masters have given them, sometimes use the name Toussaint among themselves. And there's enormous enthusiasm among, by example, Frederick Douglass, who later is actually appointed an American ambassador to Haiti. So that's for Haiti. Finally, for South America, again, there's a kind of shift over time. So at the beginning of the South American revolts, which is 1808, 1809, 1810, enormous enthusiasm in the United States. Because again, the feeling is, hey, they're doing what we did. They're copying us. What we do must have been great, right? Because everybody else wants to do it. So Bolivar, of course, is universally referred to as the Washington of South America. There's an historian who actually did a study showing that there were something like 200 American babies who got the name Simon Bolivar, including a guy named Simon Bolivar Buckner, who grew up to become a general of the Confederacy and then the governor of Kentucky. So, so there's this enormous enthusiasm. But then later on, as it becomes clear that the South American revolutions are not actually going to follow the same path that the American Revolution took, that it's going to be messier, that it's going to be more divisive, then the enthusiasm tends to wane. So that by the 1820s, 1830s, Bolivar is no longer such a hero. But even so, if you go, for example, just to where I live in New York City, and you go down to Central Park South, you see two absolutely immense equestrian statues on Central Park South, sort of golden colored equestrian statues facing each other. One is of San Martin, Jose de San Martin, who was the liberator of Argentina, and the other is Simon Bolivar. So and that's a kind of still a kind of legacy of this moment of great enthusiasm for the South American revolutions, and for Bolivar himself, seen as kind of the imitator of Washington. Later, he's increasingly seen as an imitator of Bonaparte, and at that point, the Americans don't like him so much.
I think you had it in your book. I haven't read it if I read it in your book or what, but I found it fascinating that Napoleon commissioned himself to be painted on a white steed, and meanwhile he was really riding a mule the whole time. So I found that fascinating. You touched on it. I'm not sure how to ask the question, but reading your book, maybe I was tone deaf, but I never made the correlation between really your four guys, your four focus paint, and the former president. But I do understand the cult of personality and the charisma thing. So I've been I didn't see the connection, but I don't know if other people have made that, thrust it on you. But got a question here. What's the relationship between on horseback, quote unquote, and charisma?
Well, that's a great question, and I didn't talk about it much in the talk, but I'm happy to talk about it now. So as I said, all four of these figures were military leaders, military heroes, and of course the phrase "the man on horseback" is a kind of phrase for a military leader who seizes power in a coup d'état. So that's the most obvious connection. But actually, horses have an important part in the story, because if you look at what one of the things that very much helped create this charismatic aura in this period was the fact that all four of these people either were or claimed to be great horseback riders. In fact, three of them were. So George Washington was well known for being one of the greatest horsemen of his era. He was like any member of the Virginian gentry. He was riding horses from an early age and was very, very, very good at it, absolutely at home in the saddle. The same was true of Tucson Duvall. I've already mentioned how he learned when he was still very young to actually jump up on the backs of wild horses and break them. Was really an incredibly talented rider. He was known as the centaur of the savannah. Because of his skill at riding, because he was spent so long in the saddle. The same was true of Bolivar, who was also as a nobleman from Venezuela, learned to ride from a very early age, completely at home in the saddle, and during these very long and incredibly grueling campaigns, would spend half the day literally on horseback. Napoleon, interestingly, was never a very great, he was not a natural rider. He had gone to military school in France, but he'd gone to military school for artillery officers who didn't actually ride, not cavalry officers. So he never really learned to ride properly until he was an adult, and he never was wholly comfortable with it. It's like somebody who learns how to ski too late, right? Or ride or drive or ride a bicycle too late. So he was always sort of notoriously bad on horseback. It didn't help that he was on the short side, not as short as people sometimes think, but he was on the short side. So as Mark said, during the actual during the campaign of 1800, which is when he's portrayed that great portrait of him on horseback, he liked himself to be portrayed that way, striding over the Alps on horseback. In fact, he actually got over the Alps on a mule, much more comfortable that way, wrapped in a blanket against the cold rather than sort of in his full military uniform. But it's important just to think about, what it could mean to be on horseback at that period. And I'll talk about Washington in particular, because for one thing, a really good horse at the time, incredibly expensive, first of all. The kind of war horse that George Washington would ride would be the equivalent of $200,000 to $300,000 today. So it was not a small investment. And just as you're riding a Porsche or driving a Porsche or BMW today, and it says something about your level of income. So people could tell from the horse you're riding whether you're riding an old nag or whether you're riding a really good war horse. That would make a big difference. And so somebody like Washington, who could afford, thanks to Martha, he could afford the absolute best horses in America, really looked very impressive and would have struck people as incredibly impressive. And all the more so, interestingly, there are great stories about when George Washington arrives in Massachusetts to take command of the Continental Army in 1775. Because it's clear that, this is Massachusetts and this is Boston. It's still a somewhat Puritan city. It's not a city given over to great sort of displays of wealth or of, it's not a very flamboyant city, to say the least. People dress, they dress down, they dress soberly, they dress modestly. And here comes Washington riding into town on this amazing horse, in an absolutely perfectly tailored uniform with a powdered wig, looking like $1 million. And the Bostonians had never seen anything like this. And they're all plotzing basically all over the place. Abigail Adams writes this letter to John, who's in Philadelphia at the time, and says, "I've never seen anything so beautiful." And then she quotes a line from Dryden. He says, "He's like a temple built by the gods." And John Adams was always very jealous of Washington, and this letter obviously did not help one little bit when he got it from his wife. It was just melting into a little puddle at the sight of George Washington. But the horse mattered, and the horse mattered for all of them. It's why Bonaparte was so intent on having himself portrayed on horseback like that.
Well, I want to thank you for doing this tonight. This has been great. Thank you for doing this. The name of the book is Men on Horseback. His name is David Bell. It's available at 8 Cousins. Professor Bell, when you do come, when the pandemic is over and you're going back to the vineyard and you're stopping at Seafood Sam's, the museum's on the green is just around the corner. So we're literally yards from that. So please make sure you stop and see us before you catch the ferry. So thank you very much for doing this. This has been wonderful.
Well, it was a great pleasure. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you all for coming. And I hope to see you all in Falmouth at some point. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us.